Somewhere over the Pacific, 1943, a Japanese airman sat in the fuselage of his bomber and heard the sound every man in his crew had learned to dread. The stitching, hammering rattle of enemy machine gun fire walking across the wing. He did not need to look to know what came next. There was a beat of silence, almost peaceful, and then the whole world outside his window turned orange. The wing was on fire, not smoking, not damaged, burning all at once the way a rag soaked in gasoline burns, because that is very nearly what it was. He had known this moment would come from the first day he was assigned to this aircraft. Every man who flew it knew. They flew the finest long-range bomber Japan had ever built, a machine that could strike targets farther away than the enemy believed possible, and they flew it knowing that it carried them inside a fuel tank with no protection at all, so that a single burst of tracer could turn the entire aircraft into a torch in seconds. They even had a grim, quiet name for it among themselves, the flying lighter, the one-shot lighter, because that was all it took. One shot. As the flames raced back toward him, the airman understood the terrible bargain his own country had made. They had built him a beautiful machine that could fly to the ends of the earth. They had simply forgotten to build one that would bring him back. Before I get into it, a little backstory. My dad fought in the Second World War, and growing up he told me stories about it all the time. And the more I listened, the more one thing fascinated me. Not what our side did, but what it looked like from the other side. The men who were supposed to win, what they saw, what they were told, and the moment they realized none of it was true. So that's how I like to tell these stories, through the eyes of the enemy who couldn't stop us. And now here I am, passing on the stories I learned to you. To understand the horror of that burning wing, you have to understand the pride that came before it. Because the bomber that killed so many of its own crews began its life as one of the great success stories of the Japanese War. The Pacific is almost unimaginably vast. Distances that would span all of Europe are nothing out there, just more empty blue water. And for a nation trying to fight a war across that ocean, range was everything. A bomber that could only fly a few hundred miles was nearly useless when the enemy was 1,000 miles away. So when Japanese engineers set out to build a new land-based naval bomber, they were given one demand above all others. It had to fly farther than anything the world had seen. It had to be able to reach out across those enormous distances, strike, and return. And they succeeded brilliantly. The bomber they built could fly distances that genuinely shocked the Allies. In the opening days of the war, it announced itself in the most dramatic way imaginable. Flying from bases the British thought were safely out of range, these bombers found two of the most powerful warships in the Royal Navy, a battleship and a battle cruiser steaming off the coast of Malaya, and sank them both. Two great capital ships sent to the bottom by land-based aircraft, something many admirals had insisted was impossible. It was a stunning blow, and it made the reputation of the bomber and the men who flew it. Here was a machine that could reach anywhere across the Pacific and deliver a killing blow. Japan had every reason to be proud of it, but that range had a price, and the price was paid in the bodies of the men who flew it. There is an iron law in aircraft design, and it cannot be cheated. Everything you add to a plane costs weight, and weight costs range. Armor plate to protect the crew is heavy. Self-sealing fuel tanks, the rubber-lined tanks that close their own bullet holes before the fuel can catch fire, are heavy. Fire extinguishing systems are heavy. All the things that keep a crew alive when the enemy finally gets his guns on target, all of it adds weight, and every kilogram of it steals away some of the precious range that Japan valued above all else. So the designers made a choice. To get the enormous range the Navy demanded, they stripped the bomber of nearly everything that would have protected the men inside it. They left out the armor. They left out the self-sealing tanks. And to carry enough fuel to cross those vast distances, they filled the wings with huge, unprotected fuel tanks, thin-skinned containers of gasoline sitting right where enemy fire was most likely to strike. On paper, it was a reasonable trade. More fuel, more range, more reach. In the air, against an enemy with machine guns, it was a death sentence written into the blueprints. The men who flew it were not fools. They understood exactly what they were sitting on. That is why the grim nicknames spread through the squadrons. They flew a flying cigar, a machine shaped like one and just as ready to light. They joked about it the way soldiers everywhere joke about the things that terrify them, because the alternative was to think too hard about the reality. The reality was that their aircraft had almost no ability to absorb damage. A fighter that would have bounced its bullets off an armored American bomber or put holes in self-sealing tanks that simply closed themselves could set their aircraft ablaze with a single well-aimed burst. And once the fire started, in those unprotected tanks, there was very little anyone could do but wait for the end. In the first year of the war, when Japan held the advantage and the skies were often clear of good enemy fighters, this weakness stayed hidden. The bombers flew their long missions and came home, and the trade seemed to have worked. But as the war turned, as the Allies brought in better and better fighters, flown by better and better pilots, the hidden flaw came out into the open, and it was catastrophic. The new American fighters were fast, heavily armed, and increasingly everywhere, and they learned quickly that this particular Japanese bomber did not need to be shattered or blown apart. It only needed to be set alight. Aim for the wings, for the tanks, hold the trigger for a moment, and the bomber would do the rest, trailing fire and falling out of the sky. Whole formations were butchered, the loss rates became appalling, and the crews flew anyway, mission after mission, in an aircraft they knew would not protect them, watching their friends go down in flames beside them, knowing that any day it might be their wing that caught. There is one loss that shows the deadly flaw more starkly than any other, because of who was inside. In the spring of 1943, the most important man in the entire Japanese Navy, the admiral who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, boarded one of these bombers to fly to a forward base and inspect his troops. American code breakers had learned his route. They sent a flight of long-range fighters to intercept him hundreds of miles out over the ocean, a mission of extraordinary precision. The fighters found the bombers exactly as planned, dove in, and opened fire. And the aircraft carrying the most valuable man in the Japanese Navy did exactly what the design guaranteed it would do. It caught fire and fell into the jungle. Even Japan's greatest admiral, in the best that Japanese aviation could offer, was not safe inside that flying tank of unprotected fuel. The plane spared no one, not the lowest gunner and not the commander of the fleet. And when the Americans finally got their hands on intact examples of the bomber, recovered or captured largely undamaged, their engineers examined it with something between astonishment and disbelief. They took it apart, studied it, and kept looking for the protection that any American aircraft of its size would have carried as a matter of course. The armor, the self-sealing tanks, the fire suppression, and they found none of it, to American eyes, raised on the idea that you protected your crews at almost any cost. It was baffling. They were looking at a large, capable, long-ranged bomber that had been built deliberately with almost nothing to keep its own men alive. They could not understand it. To them, it looked less like a design choice and more like a betrayal of the men who flew it. But it was a design choice, and it revealed the deepest difference between the two nations at war, a difference that ran far beyond any single aircraft. Japan had built its bomber to serve the mission. Range, reach, the striking blow. The crew was, in the cold logic of the design, expendable, a cost to be paid so that the aircraft could fly farther and hit harder. This fit a whole way of thinking, one in which the life of the individual soldier or airman was subordinate to the goal, in which sacrifice was not a tragedy to be minimized but a duty to be embraced. America thought about it in exactly the opposite way. American aircraft were built first and foremost to bring their crews home. Armor to shield the men, tanks that sealed themselves so a hit did not mean a fireball. Whole systems, whole fleets of ships and aircraft and submarines devoted just to rescuing airmen who went down in the sea. It was partly decency, and it was partly cold arithmetic of its own, because a trained crew that survives to fly again is worth more than any single airplane. But whatever the reason, the result was that an American airman who was hit had a real chance to survive, to come home, to fly and fight another day, while a Japanese airman in that bomber hit in the same place by the same bullet was very often simply dead. Multiply that across years of war, across thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of men, and you begin to see the true cost of the beautiful long-ranged bomber. Japan could build the aircraft. What it could not do was easily replace the highly trained crews who burned inside them mission after mission in machines that offered them almost no chance when things went wrong. The skilled airmen who had stunned the world in 1941 were used up, one flaming wing at a time, and the men who replaced them were less experienced, and they died even faster. And the quality of Japanese air power spiraled downward as its best men fell out of the burning sky. The airman in the burning fuselage, watching the flames race toward him, was living the final answer to a decision made years before, in a design office, by men who had been told that range mattered more than anything. They had given him a magnificent machine that could carry him to the far edge of the ocean. They had simply decided on his behalf that carrying him back safely was a luxury the mission could not afford. He had always known it. Every man who climbed into that aircraft had always known it. They had a name for it, after all. That is the quiet, terrible truth underneath the whole story of that bomber. It was not shot down because the enemy was braver, or even in the beginning because the enemy's aircraft were better. It was shot down again and again because his own country had chosen to build a machine that valued the mission over the man inside it, and it sent its finest airmen to war in flying tanks of unprotected fuel. The Americans protected their men and got them home. Japan built beautiful long-legged machines and let the men who flew them burn. And in a long war against an enemy who counted the life of every airman as something worth saving, that was a difference that no amount of range could ever make up. He had flown the finest bomber his nation could build. It carried him farther than any enemy thought possible, and in the end, it did exactly what its own crews had always grimly promised it would do. It took just one shot